The spring air in 1970 carried promises it had no intention of keeping. Willa Morrison stood in the doorway of Henderson's farm equipment, watching her husband circle the John Deere 4320 like a man who'd just discovered religion. The tractor gleamed under the showroom lights, all emerald green paint and chrome exhaust stacks that caught the afternoon sun and threw it back like a challenge. It was beautiful, it was massive, and it was going to ruin them. She knew it the way you know a storm is coming before the first cloud appears, the way her grandmother knew when the well was going dry, the way women have always known when their men are about to bet the farm on a dream that looks too good to be real. "Willa, come here. Just look at this." Jack's voice was young again, stripped of the weight he usually carried. At 45, he'd started to stoop a little, started to move like a man who'd spent 30 years wrestling with soil and weather and the slow, grinding arithmetic of farming. But now, running his calloused hand along the tractor's fender, he stood straight. His eyes were bright. She walked over slowly, her worn boots clicking on the concrete floor. The price tag sat on the seat like a coiled snake. $82,000. She'd read it 3 times already, hoping the numbers would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. "Jack," she said quietly, "that's more than the farm is worth." "Not for long." He turned to her, grabbing both her hands. His palms were rough as sandpaper, warm. "Don't you see? With this we can work twice the land in half the time. The Johnson place is going up for sale. We could expand, really expand." A man materialized beside them like he'd been waiting in the wings. Caldwell Brennan. Mid-50s, grey suit that probably cost more than their truck, smile that never quite reached his eyes. He worked for First Agricultural Bank, and he had the kind of face that looked friendly until you noticed it wasn't. "Mr. Morrison," Brennan said, extending his hand, "have you had a chance to look over the financing options?" Jack shook his hand with the enthusiasm of a man who didn't understand he was shaking hands with a future he couldn't afford. "We're very interested." "Outstanding. Let's talk terms." Brennan pulled a folder from his briefcase. $82,000, 10-year note at 8% interest. Very competitive rate, very reasonable. Willa felt her stomach clench. 8%. 10 years. The word sounded reasonable the way a trap sounds reasonable when you don't see the spring. "And the monthly payment?" she asked. Brennan's smile flickered, just for a second, like he wasn't used to the wife asking questions. $996 a month. Perfectly manageable for an operation your size. $1,000 a month. Willa did the math in her head. $12,000 a year, for 10 years, plus interest. The room felt smaller suddenly. The tractor looked bigger. "Jack," she said again, but he wasn't listening. He was already nodding, already reaching for the pen Brennan was offering, like it was a trophy instead of a signature on a debt that would outlive most marriages. "We'll make it work, Willa. I promise you. This is our future." She wanted to say no, wanted to grab that pen and snap it in half, wanted to drag him out of that showroom and back to the truck and back to their small, paid-for farm where they weren't rich, but they were free. But she looked at his face, at the hope burning there like a pilot light that had finally caught, and she couldn't bring herself to blow it out. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." The pen moved across the paper. Caldwell Brennan's smile widened. And somewhere in the universe, a clock started ticking. 3 months later, Jack Morrison died doing what he loved, which is what people always say when they can't think of anything else to say about a man who worked himself to death. The call came at 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon in late July. Willa was in the garden, pulling weeds from between the tomato plants, when she heard the truck coming too fast down the gravel drive. She stood up, dirt on her knees, already knowing, already feeling the shape of it. Rob Sullivan, their neighbor, climbed out of his pickup like he was climbing out of a nightmare. His face was grey, his hands were shaking. "Willa," he said, just her name, nothing else. She dropped the trowel. "Where?" "South 40. The new tractor. I found him. His voice broke. "I'm so sorry." The drive to the field took 5 minutes but felt like 5 hours. The John Deere 4320 sat in the middle of the half-ploughed ground, engine still running, that deep diesel rumble vibrating the air. Jack was slumped over the wheel, one hand still gripping it, like he was trying to hold on to something even in death. Willa climbed up into the cab, turned off the engine. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. His skin was already cooling, his eyes were closed. He looked almost peaceful, except for the tightness around his mouth, like even dying he'd been worried about finishing the row. "Oh, Jack," she whispered, "you stupid, beautiful man." The heart attack, the doctor said later, had been massive, instant. He wouldn't have felt much. Small mercies, people called them. Small, bitter mercies that tasted like ash. The funeral was 3 days later, and it rained the whole time. Not the soft, cleansing rain that makes things grow. The hard, relentless kind that turns dirt to mud and turns mourning into an endurance test. They buried Jack on the hill overlooking the creek, the spot where his grandfather had first broken the sod 80 years ago. The casket was simple pine. The flowers were from Willa's garden. The crowd was everybody. Pastor Samuel Reed spoke about faith and loss and the mysterious ways of the Lord. But Willa didn't hear most of it. She stood at the graveside in her black dress, the only good dress she owned, watching the rain hammer the casket lid like it was trying to wake him up. Like if it just hit hard enough, Jack would sit up and laugh and say it was all a mistake. But he didn't. They lowered him into the ground. People filed past, squeezing her shoulder, murmuring condolences that blurred together into a hum of pity and platitudes. Rob Sullivan stood at the back, hat in his hands, crying openly. Jack's few remaining cousins came from 2 counties over, stayed for the church lunch, left before the dishes were done. And then it was just Willa, standing in the cemetery in the rain, watching the gravediggers fill in the hole. She didn't cry. Couldn't cry. The tears were there, a pressure behind her eyes like a dam about to break, but they wouldn't fall. Later, she thought. Later, when she was alone. When there was no one to see her fall apart. She drove home in the truck that Jack had bought used 15 years ago, the one that burned oil and had a crack in the windshield that grew a little longer every winter. The wipers beat a rhythm against the rain. The farm came into view, the white house with the sagging porch, the red barn that needed paint, the machine shed where the John Deere 4320 sat like a monument to ambition and poor timing. Willa parked the truck, sat there for a long time, hands on the wheel. Then she went inside, made herself a cup of coffee she didn't drink, and waited for the other shoe to drop. It dropped at 7:30 that evening. Caldwell Brennan arrived in a black sedan that looked like it had never touched a dirt road in its life. He wore the same grey suit, or one identical to it, and carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Willa had spent on groceries in the last year. She met him at the door, didn't invite him in. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, with a practiced sadness that she imagined he'd used 100 times before. "I'm terribly sorry for your loss. Jack was a good man." "Thank you," she said flatly. "I hate to intrude at a time like this, but there are some financial matters we need to discuss. Time-sensitive matters." He shifted his briefcase. "May I come in?" She stepped aside, led him to the kitchen table, sat down across from him, and folded her hands and waited. Brennan opened the briefcase with the crisp efficiency of a surgeon preparing for an amputation. He pulled out a stack of papers, set them on the table between them like an accusation. "I've prepared a complete summary of Jack's outstanding loans with the bank," he said. "I thought it would be helpful for you to see the full picture." Willa pulled the papers toward her. The top sheet was a summary. The numbers hit her like a fist. Equipment loan, John Deere 4320, $68,412. 6-bottom plow, $12,800. 12-row planter, $8,200. Disc harrow, $9,300. Total outstanding principal, $98,712. She stared at the numbers, read them again. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Jack said the tractor was $82,000. That was the purchase price, yes, but there were fees, processing fees, documentation fees, insurance, and he financed the other equipment shortly after. I believe he intended to tell you." Brennan's tone was flat, clinical. Unfortunately, circumstances intervened. $98,000. She tried to wrap her mind around it, failed. "I don't have that kind of money," she said. "I understand. Very few people do." He pulled out another sheet of paper, which is why the bank is prepared to offer a solution. "We'll liquidate the assets, the tractor, the implements, put them up for auction, apply the proceeds to the principal. It's the cleanest way forward." "And what's left after that?" Brennan's face was carefully neutral. "Realistically, based on current market values, we'll recover approximately $30,000, which would leave you with a remaining debt of roughly $67,000. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a dog was barking. The refrigerator hummed. Willa could hear her own heartbeat. $67,000, she repeated. "Yes. And if I can't pay it? Then we would be forced to foreclose on the land. It's not something we want to do, Mrs. Morrison." "But the bank has obligations, fiduciary responsibilities." He said the words like they were a shield, like they absolved him of everything. Willa looked down at her hands. They were rougher than they'd been a year ago, calluses on calluses. The nails were short, jagged, farmers' hands, widows' hands now. "When?" she asked. "The auction is scheduled for October 25th. Gives us time to advertise, bring in buyers from neighbouring counties. The bank will, of course, handle all the arrangements." "And after the auction? How long do I have to pay the rest?" Brennan closed his briefcase, stood up. "The bank will expect $2,000 every 6 months. First payment due November 30th. If you fall behind..." "You foreclose," Willa finished. "Yes." She didn't stand up, didn't walk him to the door, just sat there, hands folded on the table as he let himself out. Heard his car start, heard the gravel crunch as he drove away. Then, finally, she cried. The next 6 weeks passed in a fog. Willa went through the motions of living, fed the chickens, tended the garden, avoided the machine shed where the John Deere 4320 sat gathering dust. At night, she lay in the bed she'd shared with Jack for 23 years and stared at the ceiling and did math in her head until the numbers blurred into nonsense. $67,000. She had $247 in the bank account. The property taxes were due in December, $1,200. She needed seed for next spring, fuel, basic repairs. The math didn't work. No matter how many times she ran it, no matter how many corners she tried to cut in her head, the math didn't work. People came by, neighbours, church ladies with casseroles and condolences. They all said the same things. "If there's anything you need, you're so brave. Jack would want you to be happy." What they meant, she knew, was, "When are you going to give up?" She could see it in their eyes. The pity, the certainty. Poor Willa Morrison, 42 years old, trying to run a farm by herself with $98,000 in debt and a husband in the ground. "Give her 6 months," they whispered. "Maybe a year if she's stubborn. Then she'll sell, move to town, get a job at the diner, start over." But this was her home. Jack's home. His grandfather's home. The land had been in the Morrison family for 3 generations. Their blood and sweat were in this soil. Their names were on that gravestone on the hill. She wasn't leaving. The question was, how could she stay? October 25th dawned cold and grey, the kind of late autumn day that promises winter and delivers on the promise early. By 9 in the morning, the farmyard was full of trucks, farmers from 3 counties, some there to bid, most there to watch. Auctions were entertainment in the rural Midwest. Tragedy is spectacle, a reminder that it could happen to anyone. Willa stood by the barn, hands shoved deep in the pockets of Jack's old canvas jacket. It still smelled like him. Sawdust and motor oil, and the faint ghost of the drugstore aftershave he'd worn on Sundays. She'd been wearing it every day since the funeral, like armor. The auctioneer set up on a makeshift platform, a microphone crackling with feedback. Earl something. She'd seen him before. Fast-talking man with a voice like a machine gun and a smile that never stopped. "Morning, folks," Earl's voice boomed across the yard. We've got some quality equipment here today. Real quality. Let's not waste time. First up, we've got the big dog, the crown jewel, a 1970 John Deere 4320, barely 500 hours on her. Power steering, sound guard body, the works. Bought new this spring by Jack Morrison, God rest his soul. Willa flinched. Hearing Jack's name from this stranger's mouth felt like a violation. Now this is a farmer's dream right here, Earl continued. Who's going to start the bidding for me? What do I hear? 20,000? Come on, folks, this baby cost north of 80. 20,000? Silence. The farmers stood in clusters, hands in pockets, faces grim. 20,000 was a king's ransom, more than most of them made in 2 years. All right, 18,000? Do I hear 18? More silence. Then, from the back, a hand went up. A man Willa didn't recognize, hat pulled low, could have been from anywhere. 18, Earl shouted. I got 18,000, do I hear 19? The bidding crept upward in painful $500 increments. 18.5, 19, 19.5. Each bid felt like watching pieces of Jack's dream get carved up and sold for parts. When it finally stopped at $22,300, Willa felt nothing, just a hollow exhaustion that went bone deep. Sold! Earl's gavel came down like a gunshot. They moved on. The 6-bottom plough, the 12-row planter, the disc harrow, the grain drill. One by one, the equipment rolled away, towed behind trucks driven by strangers who didn't know Jack, didn't know what these machines had meant to him. By noon, the yard was half empty. The crowd had thinned. The coffee from the church lady's tent had gone cold. All right, folks, Earl called out. Last item. We've got a 1949 Farmall M, narrow front end, gasoline engine, been in the Morrison family since new. Now, I'll be honest, she's seen better days, needs some love, but she runs, starts every time. Who'll give me... Stop. Willa's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. People turned, stared. She walked forward, out of the shadows by the barn, into the center of the yard. Her boots crunched on the gravel. She stopped in front of the auctioneer's platform, looked Earl in the eye. That tractor is not part of this auction, she said clearly. Earl blinked, looked confused, looked over at Caldwell Brennan, who was standing near the front, clipboard in hand, expression carefully blank. Ma'am, Earl said, everything on the premises is... That tractor was bought and paid for by Jack's father in 1949. Cash. There's no lien on it. It's not bank property. Check the deed. Brennan stepped forward. Mrs. Morrison, we need to liquidate every asset to maximize recovery. Even a few $100 is not worth violating the terms of your own contract, Willa said. Her voice was steady, quiet, but something in it made Brennan stop mid-sentence. That tractor is mine. It stays. For a long moment, nobody moved. The crowd watched like they were watching a poker game where the stakes had just gotten real. Brennan pulled out his folder, flipped through papers. His jaw tightened. Then, slowly, he nodded. Fine, he said. Keep your junk. Earl cleared his throat. Well then, folks, that concludes today's auction. Thank you all for coming. The crowd dispersed slowly, conversations rising like steam. Willa stood in the yard, watching them go. The farmyard looked naked now, empty. Just the old Farmall M sitting where it had sat for 20 years, rusty and forgotten, the only thing left. She walked over to it, ran her hand along the faded red paint. The metal was cold. The tires were flat. A bird had built a nest in the engine compartment. This was all she had now. This relic. This museum piece that most farmers wouldn't take if you paid them. Caldwell Brennan approached, leather shoes crunching on the gravel. Total from the auction is $32,650, he said, not looking at her. After the auctioneer's commission and fees, we can apply roughly $30,000 to your debt. That leaves you with a balance of $67,842. $67,842. The number hung in the air between them like smoke. The bank is willing to work with you, Brennan continued. His voice had taken on a rehearsed quality, like he was reading from a script. $2,000 every 6 months. First payment, November 30th. If you can maintain that schedule, you'll have the debt paid off in 17 years, Willa said quietly. Brennan paused. Yes, approximately. And if I miss a payment? Foreclosure proceedings begin immediately. She looked past him at the house, at the hill where Jack was buried, at the fields that stretched out brown and bare under the grey sky. I'll make the payments, she said. Brennan actually laughed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. Mrs. Morrison, be realistic. You have no equipment. You have no income stream. You have... He gestured at the Farmall M. That. You're going to farm this land with a 30-year-old tractor? Something sparked in Willa's chest. It was small. It was fragile. But it was warm. It was anger. Yes, she said, looking him straight in the eye. That's exactly what I'm going to do. The smile slid off Brennan's face. He stared at her like she'd just announced she was going to fly to the moon. You'll kill yourself trying, he said. Maybe. But I'll die on my land, not in some bank office begging for mercy I won't get. Brennan shook his head slowly, closed his briefcase with a sharp click. The bank's offer stands for 30 days. After that, we begin foreclosure proceedings. Think it over, Mrs. Morrison. Really think it over. He walked to his car, drove away. The sound of his engine faded into the distance, leaving only the wind and the silence. Willa stood in the empty yard, the October sun breaking through the clouds just long enough to throw her shadow long across the ground. She looked at the Farmall M, at the rust, at the flat tires, at the bird's nest. All right, she said out loud to the tractor, to Jack, to herself. All right, let's see what we can do. The wind picked up. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called. The first snow of winter was still a month away, but Willa could already feel it coming. The cold, the hard season. She turned and walked toward the machine shed, Jack's jacket heavy on her shoulders, her mind already moving to the next problem, the next impossible task. Behind her, the Farmall M sat silent and still, waiting. It had been waiting for 20 years. It could wait a little longer. The first winter after Jack died, the cold didn't just come through the walls of the farmhouse. It lived there. Willa would wake at 4 in the morning to a bedroom so frigid she could see her breath hanging in the darkness like small ghosts. The wood stove in the living room devoured firewood faster than she could cut it, and cutting it meant going out to the back 40 with a bow saw and a wheelbarrow because the chainsaw had died in November and she couldn't afford to fix it. The $67,000 debt sat at the kitchen table with her every night, an invisible guest, a weight that made the coffee taste like ashes. The bank sent letters, formal, crisp envelopes with the First Agricultural Bank logo embossed in the corner. She used them to start fires in the wood stove, watching the numbers curl and blacken and turn to smoke. It felt good burning those letters, small victories in a war she wasn't sure she could win. But the letters kept coming, and November 30th was circled on the calendar in red ink, getting closer with the mathematical certainty of a debt that doesn't care if you're ready or not. $2,000. She had to find $2,000 by November 30th or lose everything. The machine shed was colder than the house. Willa stood in the doorway in late November, bundled in Jack's jacket and 2 sweaters underneath, staring at the Farmall M like it was a puzzle she didn't know how to solve. The tractor looked worse in the harsh light of the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Rust bloomed across the red paint like a disease. The rear tires were flat, cracked from years of sitting. The engine was seized. A bird's nest sat in the manifold, twigs and dried grass spilling over the edges. To most people it was junk, a relic from an era when farming was done with muscle and prayer, instead of hydraulics and diesel. The kind of thing you hauled to the scrapyard for $20 and considered yourself lucky. To Willa, it was the only tool she had left. She'd spent the last 3 days in the house, going through Jack's things, looking for something, anything that would help. And she'd found it in a cardboard box in the closet, wrapped in an oil-stained towel, the operator's manual for the Farmall M. 40 pages, water-stained and dog-eared, with pencil notes in the margins in Jack's father's handwriting. Check valve clearance every 100 hours. Keep magneto dry. Don't force nothing. She'd sat on the bedroom floor reading it by lamplight until her eyes burned, pronouncing words she didn't understand. Carburetor, distributor, magneto, a language of metal and combustion that Jack had always handled, that she'd never needed to learn because he was there, grease-stained and patient, fixing things before she even knew they were broken. But he wasn't there anymore, so she would learn. The tires came first because the tractor couldn't move without them, and Willa couldn't afford new ones. New rear tires for a Farmall M, she'd learned from a phone call to Henderson's farm equipment, ran about $180 each, $360 total, money she didn't have. Money that could have bought seed or paid the electric bill for 3 months or fed her through the winter. So she would patch the old ones. The manual said it was possible. Difficult, but possible. You had to break the tire loose from the rim, remove the tube, find the leaks, patch them, wrestle the whole assembly back together. A job that normally required tire irons and a hydraulic press and 2 strong men who knew what they were doing. Willa had tire irons, old ones, rusty, that she found hanging on the shed wall, and she had a sledgehammer, and she had something the manual didn't account for, desperation that felt like rage condensed into focus. It took her 2 days to get the first tire off. 2 days of hammering and prying and swearing words she'd never said out loud before. The tire iron slipped and gashed her knuckle open, blood mixing with rust and old grease. She wrapped it in a rag and kept working. Her shoulders screamed, her hands blistered, then bled, then calloused over. But on the evening of the second day, the tire finally broke free from the rim with a sound like a gunshot, and the tube came out deflated and ancient, rubber cracked and perished. She filled the bathtub with water and submerged the tube section by section, watching for bubbles. Found 7 leaks. 7 small holes where air had escaped over the years, slow and patient, draining the life out of the tire, the way debt drains the life out of a farm. The patch kit cost $4.30 at the hardware store in town. The man behind the counter, old Henderson himself, had looked at her with something between pity and disbelief. "You're patching tractor tubes yourself, Willa." "Can't afford not to." "I could send a boy out, do it proper." "How much?" $30, both tires. She'd counted out $4.30 in quarters and dimes. "I'll do it myself." Henderson had shaken his head slowly, but took her money without another word. Getting the tire back onto the rim was harder than getting it off. The manual made it sound simple. Position the tube inside the tire, align the tire with the rim, work it on gradually with the tire irons. Simple. It was not simple. Willa spent an entire day wrestling with it. The tire was stiff, uncooperative, fighting her at every turn. She used the sledgehammer, used her body weight, used leverage and physics, and every curse word she could remember, and some she invented on the spot. Her hands were raw meat by the time the tire finally slipped into place with a pneumatic thump that echoed through the shed. She sat on the cold concrete floor, back against the tractor, breathing hard, looking at her hands. They were bleeding again. Dirt and grease were ground into cuts that would probably scar. Her fingernails were broken. Her knuckles were swollen, but the tire was on. She inflated it with a hand pump, working the handle up and down for what felt like hours, feeling the tire firm up beneath her touch, coming back to life. When it was done, she stood back and looked at it. 1 tire, 1 small victory, 3 more to go. By the time December arrived, all 4 tires were patched and mounted and inflated. The Farmall M sat a little higher now, like it was waking up from a long sleep, but it still wouldn't run. The engine was the next problem, and it was a big one. Willa had never worked on an engine before, never even looked under the hood of the truck, except to check the oil when Jack reminded her. The Farmall's engine was a mystery wrapped in rust, a 4-cylinder chunk of iron that had been sitting idle for over a year, accumulating water and dirt and God knew what else. She opened the manual to the section on engine maintenance and started reading. Oil capacity, 4 quarts, check level weekly. Spark plugs, gap at 25 thousandths of an inch. Distributor cap, inspect for cracks, clean contacts monthly. The words swam on the page. She read each section 3 times, 4 times, until they started to make a kind of sense. Then she went to work. The oil came out thick as molasses, black and gritty with sediment. She drained it into a pan, marveling at how something that was supposed to lubricate had turned into sludge. 4 fresh quarts went in, golden and clean, disappearing into the engine's dark heart. The spark plugs came out crusted with carbon, the gaps closed tight. She cleaned them with a wire brush until her arms ached, set the gaps with a feeler gauge according to the manual specifications. 25 thousandths of an inch. So small she could barely see it, but the manual said it mattered, so she made it right. The distributor cap was cracked, a spiderweb fracture that would let moisture in, prevent the spark from reaching the plugs. The part cost $5 at Henderson's. She installed it herself, following the diagram in the manual, checking and rechecking each connection. Then came the carburetor. The carburetor was the heart of the fuel system, the place where gasoline and air mixed in precise ratios to create the combustion that made the engine run. It was also, Willa discovered, a nightmare of tiny parts and precise adjustments. The Farmall wouldn't start, which meant it wasn't getting fuel. The manual had a whole section on carburetor troubleshooting. She read it until she could recite it from memory. Then, with hands that shook from cold and nervousness, she began to disassemble it. She worked on the kitchen table because the light was better there, and because the shed was too cold to feel her fingers. She laid out each part on a clean towel in the order she removed it. Jets and floats and needles and springs, each one smaller than the last, each one critical. There were 47 pieces in total. She soaked them in a coffee can full of kerosene, scrubbing each one with an old toothbrush until the brass gleamed through decades of varnish and grime. The smell of kerosene filled the kitchen, sharp and chemical, but she didn't care. She was too focused on not losing any of the tiny parts, not breaking anything she couldn't replace. Putting it back together took 3 tries. The first time, she had pieces left over. 2 small springs that didn't seem to go anywhere. She took it apart again, laid everything out, started over. The second time, the float stuck. She'd bent something, or installed it wrong, and the whole mechanism jammed. Apart again. Check the manual. Study the diagrams. Try again. The third time it went together smoothly, each piece finding its place like it was meant to be there. She held the assembled carburetor in her hands, feeling its weight, its compact complexity. It was beautiful in a way she'd never appreciated before. A small mechanical heart that could turn fuel into motion, turn motion into survival. She installed it on the tractor, connected the fuel line, checked every connection twice. Then she stood back and looked at her work. The day she tried to start the Farmall for the first time was cold and grey, the sky the colour of old dishwater. Willa had been up since 4, too nervous to sleep. She checked the oil, checked the fuel, checked the spark plugs and the distributor and the carburetor and everything else she could think of to check. It was early January now, 2 months since the auction. She'd made the first payment, $2,000, by selling off everything she could spare. The dining room furniture Jack's mother had left them, his hunting rifle, her grandmother's silver service, 40 years of accumulated possessions that had somehow added up to barely enough. The next payment was due in 6 months. She needed the tractor running by spring or she couldn't plant. And if she couldn't plant, she couldn't make money. And if she couldn't make money, the bank would take everything. The math was simple and brutal. She climbed onto the steel seat. It was cold enough to burn through her jeans. The steering wheel was smooth under her hands, worn by decades of use by Jack's father, then by Jack. "Okay," she said out loud, to the tractor, to Jack, to herself. "Let's see what you've got." She pulled the choke, turned the key, pressed the starter button. The engine groaned, turned over slowly, reluctantly, like an old man getting out of bed on a cold morning. Nothing. She tried again. Same result. The starter whined, the engine turned, but no ignition, no spark of life. Panic started to creep in, cold fingers around her throat. What if she'd done it wrong? What if she'd broken something? What if the engine was dead and she'd just wasted 2 months on a pile of junk that would never run? She closed her eyes, took a breath, remembered something Jack used to say when the truck wouldn't start, when the weather was cold and the battery was weak. "Gotta feather the throttle, Willa. Give it just a little gas while you're cranking. Not too much, just enough." She opened her eyes, pressed the throttle pedal down just slightly, turned the key again, hit the starter. The engine groaned, turned, coughed once. She held the throttle steady, kept the starter engaged. The engine coughed again. A puff of black smoke shot out of the exhaust pipe, hanging in the cold air like a question mark. Then, with a roar that shook the entire machine shed, the Farmall M shuddered to life. The sound was magnificent, not the smooth purr of the John Deere's diesel. This was raw, mechanical, honest. The deep, rhythmic pop, 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 pop of 4 cylinders firing in sequence, each explosion a small declaration that the machine was alive, that it refused to die, that it still had work to do. Willa sat on that cold steel seat and cried. Not delicate tears, not quiet, dignified weeping. She sobbed, her whole body shaking, the sound of her grief and relief and exhaustion lost in the roar of the engine. She'd done it. By herself, with her own bleeding hands and stubborn will, she'd brought this machine back to life. She let the engine run for 20 minutes, warming up, settling into its rhythm. The whole shed vibrated with it. The smell of gasoline and exhaust filled the air, and it was the most beautiful smell in the world. It was the smell of hope. Spring came late in 1971, and when it finally arrived, it arrived cold and wet and mean. Willa was ready. She'd spent the winter preparing, moving with a kind of focused intensity that surprised her. She'd found an old 2-bottom plough in the back of the shed, rusty but functional. She'd greased the moldboards, tightened the bolts, replaced the worn coulters with ones she'd ordered from a catalogue, using money she'd scraped together selling eggs to neighbours. The plough wasn't much, nothing compared to the 6-bottom hydraulic monster Jack had bought with the John Deere. But it would turn soil, and that was all she needed. By mid-April, her neighbours were already in their fields. She could see them from her kitchen window, driving their big tractors, pulling wide implements, covering acres in hours. Rob Sullivan to the north had a new Steiger 4-wheel drive, a massive articulated beast that looked like something from a science fiction movie. She watched him plough his fields, sitting high in an enclosed cab with heat and a radio, protected from the wind and the sun and the reality of the work. She was going out in the open, on a steel seat, behind a tractor that was older than she was. The first day in the field, she managed 4 acres. 4 acres in 12 hours of work. Her neighbours were doing 40. It was humiliating, it was exhausting, and it was all she had. The Farmall M had no power steering. Every turn of the wheel was an act of brute force, arms straining, shoulders burning. The narrow front end made it twitchy, prone to wandering, requiring constant correction. And the seat, God, the seat. It was bare steel, no padding, no suspension. Every bump and rut in the field translated directly to her spine. By the end of the first day, Willa could barely walk. Her back was a solid sheet of pain. Her hands were blistered, despite the gloves. Her face was windburned, and her eyes were full of dust. She made herself a dinner she was too tired to eat, took a bath in water she had to heat on the stove because the water heater had given up in February, went to bed at 7:30 and slept without dreams. The next day, she did it again, and the day after that, and the day after that. Rob Sullivan stopped by on a Saturday afternoon in early May. Willa was in the field, working the same ground she'd been working all week, when she saw his truck coming down the road. He parked at the edge of the field and walked out to meet her. She shut down the Farmall and climbed off, wincing at the pain in her legs. Rob was 45, a big man with shoulders like a barn door and hands that could palm a basketball. He'd been Jack's friend, had cried at the funeral. But right now, his face was troubled. "Willa," he said, looking at her with something that might have been pity. "This is insane. You're killing yourself out here." She wiped sweat from her face with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt. "I'm fine, Rob." "You're not fine. Look at you." He gestured at the field, at the small patch of turned soil. "At this rate, you won't get your corn in until July. And even if you do, how are you going to harvest it? You can't run that old picker by yourself." "I'll figure it out." Willa. His voice softened. Jack was my friend. I loved him like a brother. And I'm telling you what he would tell you if he were here. This is too much. Sell the farm, take what you can get, start over somewhere easier. Something in Willa's chest went hard and cold. This is my home, she said quietly. Jack is buried on that hill. His grandfather broke this land. I'm not leaving. Then hire help. I know a couple boys who'd work for... With what money, Rob? I've got $67,000 in debt and $200 in the bank. I can't hire help. I can barely feed myself. Rob looked at the ground, scuffed his boot in the dirt. I could loan you. No. The word came out harder than she intended. No more debt. Not ever. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman he'd known for 15 years, who'd always been quiet, always been in Jack's shadow, now standing in a field with dirt on her face and fire in her eyes. All right, he said finally. All right, Willa. You're stubborn as a damn mule, you know that? I've been told. He walked back to his truck, paused with his hand on the door. If you change your mind, I won't. He drove away, leaving a trail of dust that hung in the air long after he was gone. Willa climbed back onto the Farmall, fired it up, and went back to work. She got the corn planted by the first week of June, late, but not disastrously so. 120 acres of straight rows, planted with an old 2-row planter she'd bought at an estate sale for $50. The planter jammed constantly. She learned to carry wire and pliers, stopping every few rows to clear blockages, adjust seed depth, keep the ancient mechanism functioning through sheer will. Her neighbors drove by sometimes, slowing their trucks to watch. She could feel their eyes on her, could imagine the conversations at the coffee shop, at church, in living rooms across 3 counties. Poor Willa Morrison. Still trying. How long before she gives up? She didn't give up. Through June and July she cultivated. Through August she prayed for rain and got just enough. The corn grew, not spectacular, but adequate, 80 bushels per acre. Her neighbors were getting 120 with their fancy hybrids and perfectly timed fertilizer applications. But 80 would do. 80 would pay the bills. 80 would keep her alive. The harvest in November was brutal. She picked by hand at first, hauling ears in bushel baskets, her back screaming. Then she found an old 2-row corn picker at an auction, bought it for $75, spent a week getting it running. It was slow, it was loud, it broke down every other day. But it picked corn. By Thanksgiving, she had 9,600 bushels in the bin. Corn was selling for $1.15. That was $11,040. Gross. Seed had cost $800. Fuel for the tractor, $600. Property taxes, $1,200. Miscellaneous repairs and supplies, $600. Total expenses, $3,200. Net profit, $7,840. She took $2,000 to the bank on November 29th, one day before the payment was due, walked into the lobby, walked past the teller windows, walked straight to Caldwell Brennan's desk. He looked up, startled. She handed him the check. He looked at it, looked at her. His mouth opened, closed. "This is," he started. "On time," she finished. "I'll see you in 6 months, Mr. Brennan." She walked out before he could respond, head high, shoulders straight, allowing herself the smallest smile. Behind her, Caldwell Brennan stared at the check like it was written in a language he couldn't read. The years that followed developed a rhythm. Spring, plow, plant, pray. Summer, cultivate, fix things that broke, pray. Fall, harvest, sell, pay the bank. Winter, survive. Willa lived on $5,400 the first year, $6,200 the second, $7,000 the third. Everything else went to the debt. She patched her clothes until they were more patches than original fabric. She cut her own hair in the bathroom mirror. She heated the house with wood she cut herself. She grew vegetables in the summer and canned them for winter. She raised chickens for eggs and the occasional Sunday dinner. She learned to weld when the plow frame cracked, learned to rebuild hydraulic cylinders when the picker's lift gave out, learned to do her own electrical work when the house circuit started failing. Every repair was a choice. do it herself for almost nothing, or pay someone and eat the cost. She always chose to do it herself. The community watched. The pity in their eyes slowly changed to something else. Not quite respect, not yet, but a kind of grudging acknowledgement. She's still here, against all odds, still here. But while Willa was grinding out survival on her small farm with her ancient tractor, the world around her was changing. In 1972, corn prices jumped to $1.57. Good times, people said. In 1973, the Russians had a failed harvest and started buying American grain in massive quantities. Corn hit $3.02. The Great Grain Robbery, they called it. Farmers were getting rich, land prices soared. The farm next to Rob Sullivan's went for $2,000 an acre, twice what it had been worth 2 years earlier. The banks were eager, smiling, offering loans at rates that seemed too good to be true. Expand, they said, get bigger, leverage your assets. The good times were here to stay. Rob Sullivan borrowed $150,000 to buy 500 more acres, took another $50,000 for a new Steiger Panther, the biggest four-wheel drive tractor International Harvester made, bought an IH-1460 combine for $85,000. Variable rate loans, 8% interest. Reasonable, the bankers said. Conservative. Willa watched it happen from her small farm, from behind the wheel of her Farmall M, and felt a cold certainty settling in her bones. She'd seen this before. Jack had believed in the good times, had bet everything on growth and expansion and the promise that tomorrow would be better than today. He was buried on the hill because of that belief. So while her neighbors leveraged and expanded and bought bigger and better, Willa paid down her debt. Slowly, painfully, but steadily. 1972, paid $5,000, balance $60,000. 1973, paid $8,000, balance $52,000. 1974, paid $10,000, balance $42,000. 1975, paid $12,000, balance $30,000. Every payment was money she could have spent on a newer tractor, on better equipment, on making her life easier. But she'd learned the hardest lesson farming can teach. Debt is slavery, and she would rather be poor and free than comfortable and owned. By the fall of 1975, Willa Morrison was 47 years old. Her hands were permanently scarred, the skin tough as leather. Her back ached every morning. Her face was lined from sun and wind and worry. She drove a 1965 truck that burned oil and had 300,000 miles on it. She wore clothes from the charity bin at church. She had $7 in her checking account, but she owed only $30,000 instead of $67,000, and she slept every night without pills, without fear, without the weight of impossible debt crushing her into the mattress. Her neighbors didn't understand. They saw poverty, stubbornness, a woman who refused to accept help, refused to modernize, refused to admit defeat. What they didn't see was the ledger book she kept in the kitchen drawer, the columns of numbers meticulously recorded, income and expenses tracked to the penny, the debt balance that shrank by thousands every year while theirs grew. They didn't see freedom being purchased one hard year at a time. They would see it eventually, but not yet. The winter of 1979 came early and stayed late, and it brought with it winds that smelled like change. Willa stood in her kitchen on a January morning, listening to the radio while she fried eggs in a pan older than most of her neighbors' children. The announcer's voice was grave, discussing something called OPEC and oil embargoes, and a word that kept repeating like a drumbeat: inflation. She didn't understand all of it. Economics had never been her strong suit, but she understood numbers, and the numbers the radio was reporting made her stomach clench. Interest rates rising, 7%, 9%, predictions of higher, fuel costs up 40%, grain prices softening as the Russian buying spree ended. She turned off the radio and ate her eggs in silence, looking out the window at the Farmall M sitting in the shed. 9 years under her care now, 30 years old. The paint was almost entirely gone, faded to a mottled rust pink. She'd replaced the rear tires once, the front ones twice. The engine had been rebuilt with her own hands 2 winters ago. It was ugly. It was obsolete. It was the reason she was still here. Because while that tractor had cost her blood and sweat and uncounted hours of labor, it had never cost her a single dollar in loan payments, never trapped her in a contract she couldn't escape, never promised her the moon and delivered only debt. The ledger book sat on the table. She opened it, running her finger down the columns. Current debt balance, $22,314. In 9 years, she'd paid off $45,000. More than that, actually, when you counted the interest. Closer to $52,000. 2 more years, maybe 3, and she'd be free. She closed the book and went out to start her day. Rob Sullivan came by on a cold afternoon in late February, and Willa knew something was wrong the moment she saw his face. He'd aged badly in the last few years. The confidence that had always surrounded him like an aura had developed cracks. He was heavier now, carrying stress in his shoulders and around his middle. His new Steiger Panther sat in his yard like a monument to ambition, but he didn't look at it the way he used to. "Willa," he said, standing in her doorway, hat in his hands. "You got coffee on?" She poured him a cup and they sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Caldwell Brennan had delivered the news of her debt 9 years ago. The ghosts of those numbers still haunted the room. "My interest rate jumped," Rob said without preamble. "Variable rate loan. Went from 8% to 11%, just like that." Willa said nothing. Waited. The combine payment was $1,200 a month. Now it's $1,650. The land note went up $400. The operating line for seed and chemicals, that went up too. He looked into his coffee, like it might have answers. "I ran the numbers 3 times. Even with a good year, I can't make it work." "Can you refinance?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I tried. Bank says I'm maxed out. Debt-to-asset ratio is too high. They're not lending to operations my size anymore. Too much risk, they say. Too much exposure." "What about selling some land? Pay down the principal?" "Land values are dropping. Already down 30% from what I paid. I'd be selling for less than I owe." He set his cup down, and she saw his hand was shaking. "I'm trapped, Willa. I did everything right. Expanded when they told me to expand. Bought the equipment they said I needed. Leveraged my equity like a smart businessman. And now I'm trapped." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. It was all she could offer. "How bad is the drought?" she asked, because drought was coming. She could feel it in the air, see it in the dry winter, the lack of snow that should have been building up water for spring. "Bad. Noé's predicting one of the worst in 50 years. They sat in silence for a while, 2 farmers at a kitchen table, watching the future narrow to a point. "You're going to make it," Rob said finally. "Aren't you?" "I don't know," Willa said honestly. "But I don't owe anybody, so even if it's bad, I can wait it out. Hold my grain if prices are low. That's something." "That's everything," Rob said quietly. He left a few minutes later, and Willa watched his truck drive away, leaving tracks in the thin snow. She had a bad feeling about what was coming, a sense of gathering storm that had nothing to do with weather. The summer of 1979 was brutal. The drought Rob had predicted came with a vengeance. By June, the topsoil was powder dry, blowing away in dust devils that danced across bare fields. The corn that managed to germinate struggled, stunted, the leaves curling inward to conserve moisture that wasn't there. Willa's 120 acres suffered like everyone else's. But her costs were minimal. The Farmall sipped gasoline compared to the diesel monsters her neighbors ran. When a bearing wore out on her cultivator, she replaced it herself with a $30 part ordered from a catalog. When the irrigation pump seized, she rebuilt it on her kitchen table over a weekend. Rob Sullivan's operation, by contrast, was bleeding money. His Steiger Panther needed a transmission repair in July. The dealer quoted $12,000. He didn't have $12,000. The tractor sat idle while his crops withered. His combine, that $85,000 marvel of modern engineering, developed a problem with the feeder house. The dealer wanted $8,000 to fix it. Rob tried to do it himself, spent 2 weeks and made it worse. Finally paid the $8,000 with money he didn't have, charging it to a credit card at 19% interest. Willa heard about it at church, in the hushed conversations between hymns. The whole community was watching Rob Sullivan's empire crack, and he wasn't alone. The newspapers that fall were full of stories about interest rates. The Federal Reserve, fighting inflation, kept raising them. 12%, 14%, predictions of higher still. For farmers who'd borrowed at variable rates, it was a death sentence. A man 3 counties over shot himself in his barn, left a note for his wife and 3 kids, apologizing for the debt. The auction was scheduled for October. 2 brothers who'd farmed together for 30 years had a fistfight in the middle of Main Street, screaming at each other about whose fault it was, whose decision had ruined them. The sheriff had to break it up. Pastor Samuel Reed started a prayer group specifically for farmers in financial distress. 40 men showed up the first week, 60 the second. Willa didn't go. She kept her head down, worked her land, made her payments. In November of 1979, she paid $4,000 to the bank. The balance dropped to $18,314. 3 more payments, maybe 4, then freedom. December 2nd, 1980, dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter day that makes the world look clean and simple and full of possibility. Willa Morrison was 52 years old. She dressed in her best clothes, a navy blue skirt and white blouse she'd bought at the second-hand store, an actual coat instead of Jack's old canvas jacket, and drove to town in her truck that now had 400,000 miles on the odometer, but still ran. The check in her purse was for $7,842, the last payment. She'd spent the previous week calculating and recalculating, making sure. The debt had been $67,842. Over 10 years, with interest, she'd paid just over $75,000 total. $75,000. Paid with corn grown on 120 acres, harvested with equipment that most farmers wouldn't touch, sold penny by penny, dollar by dollar, year by grinding year. She parked in front of the bank, sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. "We did it, Jack," she whispered. "We actually did it." Then she got out and walked inside. Caldwell Brennan had retired 2 years ago, replaced by a younger man named Leon Drake. Drake was in his early 30s, sharp-suited, with the kind of confidence that came from never having failed at anything important. He represented a new generation of bankers, MBA-educated, fluent in leverage and debt-to-equity ratios, and all the modern machinery of finance. He looked up when Willa approached his desk, and she saw the brief flicker of recognition. The Morrison file. The widow who'd somehow kept making payments on a debt everyone had assumed would end in foreclosure. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, standing, offering his hand. "What can I do for you today?" She sat down, opened her purse, placed the check on his desk. He looked at it. His eyebrows rose. "This is the final payment," Willa said. $7,842. That should close the account. Drake pulled up the file on his computer. Everything was computers now, no more paper ledgers, and scrolled through. She watched his face as he ran the numbers. "Yes," he said finally. "Yes, this will—" "Mrs. Morrison, this is remarkable. You've paid off $67,000 in 10 years. With interest, closer to 75, on a 120-acre farm. That's—" "Impossible," Willa suggested. "I was going to say impressive." He pulled out the paperwork, began stamping forms. "Most operations your size couldn't service a quarter of this debt. How did you do it?" "I lived on almost nothing. Fixed everything myself. Didn't buy anything I didn't absolutely need. And I didn't take on new debt." She watched him stamp the final form. Not $1 of new debt in 10 years. He looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language. "But Mrs. Morrison, with corn prices where they were in 73 and 74, you could have leveraged your equity, expanded, bought more land. You'd be running 1,000 acres by now." "At what interest rate?" "Well, variable rate loans were around 8% then. They're higher now, of course, but 21%, Willa said quietly. I heard on the radio. Prime rate hit 21% last month. Drake shifted uncomfortably. That's an anomaly. It'll come back down. Maybe. But those farmers who leveraged at 8%? Their payments just tripled. They're losing everything. She leaned forward. Mr. Drake, I've learned something in the last 10 years. Debt is a prison. I don't care how reasonable the rate sounds. I don't care how much sense it makes on paper. The moment you owe money, someone else owns a piece of your life. And I'm done with that. Forever. He stamped the final document. The sound echoed in the quiet bank. Paid in full, he said, sliding the papers across the desk. Willa took them, looked at those 3 words. Paid in full. She stood up, shook his hand, and walked out of the bank into the December sunshine. And then, standing beside her truck, she allowed herself one single tear. It rolled down her cheek, and she wiped it away and laughed, a sound that came from somewhere deep in her chest, somewhere that had been locked tight for 10 years. She was free. The storm that had been building broke in 1981. In January, the prime interest rate hit 21.5%. Farmers who'd borrowed at variable rates saw their payments double, triple. Operations that had been profitable at 8% interest were losing money at 21%. In March, President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. The export market collapsed overnight. Corn that had been selling for $3.50 per bushel dropped to $1.80. By June, the foreclosure notices started appearing in the county newspaper. 1 a week at first, then 3, then 7. The auction signs went up on fence posts all across the heartland, bright red letters announcing the dismantling of dreams. Willa saw Rob Sullivan's auction notice on a telephone pole in town in early September of 1982. Her hands went numb reading it. Absolute auction. Sullivan Farm, 1,000 acres. Complete machinery line, Steiger Panther 4, WD tractor, International Harvester, 1460, combine plus full complement of implements. Saturday, September 18th, 10 a.m. She stood there in the middle of Main Street, people walking around her, the paper fluttering in the wind. Rob, her neighbor, Jack's friend. A good farmer who'd done everything the banks and the experts told him to do. He was losing it all. The day of the auction was overcast and warm, that peculiar late summer weather that can't decide if it's still holding on or letting go. Willa drove to Rob's farm slowly, dreading what she would see but unable to stay away. She owed him that much. Witness, presence, the small dignity of not suffering alone. The yard was full of trucks when she arrived, farmers from 6 counties, some there to bid, most there to watch, to measure their own survival against someone else's disaster. The auctioneer was setting up on a flatbed trailer, microphones screeching feedback. She parked at the back of the lot and walked through the crowd, keeping to the edges. The equipment was lined up in rows, gleaming in the diffuse sunlight. The Steiger Panther sat like a wounded giant, all that articulated power rendered useless by debt. The combine stood beside it, still wearing dust from last year's harvest, a harvest that hadn't been enough. Rob stood near the machine shed with his wife, Linda. They looked hollowed out, empty, 2 people watching their life get sold off piece by piece. Linda's eyes were red. Rob just stared at nothing. The auction started. "Good morning, folks." The auctioneer's voice was too cheerful, too bright for what was happening. "We've got some quality equipment here today, real quality. Let's not waste time. First up, the crown jewel. A Steiger Panther 4-wheel drive tractor, 280 horsepower, only 5 years old, bought new for $120,000. Who's going to start the bidding? 80,000? 70? Silence. The farmers stood with their hands in their pockets. They knew what was happening. They knew it could be them next month, next year. There was no joy in this. 60,000? The auctioneer's voice took on a pleading edge. "Come on, folks, this is a steal at 60. A hand went up. Corporate farm out of Illinois. They had cash, no debt, waiting to pick up assets at pennies on the dollar. 60. I got 60,000. Do I hear 65? Another hand, another corporate buyer. It climbed to 78,000 and stopped. The Steiger, that had cost 120,000, sold for less than 2/3 of its value. The combine went for 32,000, the planter for 4,000, the grain drill for 2,500. Each sale was a small death. Willa watched Rob's face, watched him flinch with each falling gavel. His wife had stopped watching, was just staring at the ground, arms wrapped around herself. Then the auctioneer called out the next item. "All right, folks, we've got a nice little utility tractor here. John Deere 2510, gasoline engine, good condition. Who'll start the bidding at 5,000? Willa's breath caught. She knew that tractor. It had belonged to Rob's father. Rob had learned to farm on it, the same way she'd learned on the Farmall M. It was the last link to his past, the only piece of equipment that wasn't bought on credit. 5,000? The auctioneer tried. Come on, folks, 4,000? Silence. The 2510 was too small for the corporate farms, too old for the modern operators, useless to everyone except someone who remembered what it meant. 3,000? 2? More silence. 1,000? Surely someone will give me 1,000 for a running tractor. Willa's hand went up before she could think about it. I got 1,000. The auctioneer pointed at her. Do I hear 1,500? Nobody bid. Going once, twice. Sold for $1,000 to bidder number 73. The gavel came down. Willa stood there, stunned at what she'd just done. $1,000. Money she couldn't really afford, for a tractor she didn't need. But when she looked up and saw Rob's face, saw the way he was staring at her, she knew it was the right thing. The auction ended at 3 in the afternoon. Total proceeds, $180,000 on equipment that had cost over $250,000. With the land sold separately to cover the mortgage, Rob Sullivan would walk away with nothing. Worse than nothing. Still owing money the bank would pursue until he declared bankruptcy. The crowd dispersed slowly, conversations muted, everyone uncomfortable. Willa found Rob standing by the empty machine shed, staring at the oil stains on the concrete where his equipment had sat. "Rob," she said quietly. He turned. His eyes were red but dry, past crying. "Come to watch the big shot fall, Willa? Come to see what happens when you don't listen?" The bitterness in his voice could have stripped paint. "No," she said. "I came to give you this." She held out the bill of sale for the John Deere 2510. He stared at it like it was written in a language he didn't understand. "What is this?" "It's your father's tractor. The title. It's in your name. Paid for. It's yours." "Willa, I can't." "You can. You will." She pressed the paper into his hand. "Nobody should have to lose their father's tractor, Rob. Nobody." He looked down at the bill of sale. His hands started shaking, then his shoulders, then he was crying, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken. Willa stood there, one hand on his shoulder, letting him cry. When he finally got control of himself, she spoke again. "I'm keeping the North 80 in hay this year. I need help cutting and baling. $15 an hour. Work's yours if you want it." Rob looked at her. This woman he'd pitied for 10 years, this stubborn widow who'd refused every offer of help, who'd ground out survival on an antique tractor while he'd built an empire on borrowed money. "After everything I said," he whispered, "all those times I called you foolish. Pride is expensive, Rob. I learned that watching Jack die on a tractor we couldn't afford. You don't need to learn it twice." She squeezed his shoulder. "The job's there. Think about it." She walked back to her truck, leaving Rob standing in his empty yard, holding the title to the only piece of his past he had left. The farm crisis of the 1980s didn't end quickly. It ground on for years, a slow catastrophe that hollowed out the rural Midwest like rot in timber. By 1985, over 300,000 farms had gone under. Entire small towns dried up and blew away. Main streets became ghost streets. Schools closed. Churches closed. The farmers who survived were the ones who'd been careful, conservative. The ones who hadn't leveraged everything on the promise of perpetual growth. The ones like Willa Morrison. In the spring of 1983, Willa bought 40 acres of woodland that bordered her property to the east. It had belonged to a family that had farmed it for 60 years before the bank took everything. The land went to auction, and Willa bought it for $800 an acre. $32,000. Cash. She didn't plow it. Instead, she cleared the brush, fixed the fences, and ran a small herd of beef cattle on it. Diversification, the agricultural extension agent called it. Willa called it common sense. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't bet everything on corn prices staying high. Rob Sullivan worked for her for 3 years. He was quiet, competent, grateful. He saved every dollar he made, living in a rented house in town, driving the John Deere 2510 to work every day. In 1986, he started his own custom farming business, hired himself out to small farmers who couldn't afford their own equipment, made a modest living, stayed out of debt. He and Willa remained friends, bonded by the shared understanding of what they'd survived. By 1988, the crisis had mostly passed, leaving a scarred landscape in its wake. Willa was 60 years old. Her farm had grown to 200 acres through careful purchases of foreclosed land. She owned it all outright. No mortgage, no liens, no debt of any kind. Her net worth, if you counted land and equipment and cattle, was around $420,000. She still drove the same truck, still wore clothes from the second-hand store, still lived on less than $10,000 a year. But she was wealthy in the way that mattered. She was free. The young farmers started coming to her place in the early 90s. They'd show up unannounced, usually in the evening, with broken equipment and questions. Word had spread that Willa Morrison could fix anything and that she'd teach you how if you asked nice and paid attention. A 25-year-old showed up one June evening with a hay baler that wouldn't knot. "Dealer wants $800 to fix it," the kid said, standing in her machine shed, looking miserable. Willa walked around the baler, eyeing the mechanism. "Fetch me that 3/4 wrench," she said. The kid handed it to her. She made 2 adjustments, tightened a spring, tested the knotter by hand. "Try it now." The kid hooked it to his tractor, ran a test bale. Perfect knots. He stared at her like she'd just performed a miracle. "How did you—" "It's not magic. It's just knowing how the machine works. You got a manual for this?" I think so, maybe." "Find it, read it, learn what every part does. Then when something breaks, you'll know how to fix it." She wiped her hands on a rag. "Dealer charges $800 because people don't know any better. You just saved yourself $800 in 15 minutes. Do that enough times, you stay in business. That's the secret." The kid left with his baler running and a new understanding that independence wasn't just about owning land. It was about knowing how to take care of what you owned. More came after him. Young farmers trying to make it work, trying to avoid the mistakes of the boom and bust 80s. Willa taught them all the same lessons. Fix it yourself. Live below your means. Debt is slavery. Freedom is worth more than flash. She wasn't trying to create a movement, wasn't trying to change agriculture. She was just passing on what she'd learned, paid for in blood and sweat, and 10 years of brutal humiliation. And slowly, quietly, a different kind of farming took root in those young people. Careful farming, sustainable farming, farming that measured success not in acres, but in autonomy. The letters started arriving in the mid-90s, handwritten notes from farmers she'd helped. A couple in Nebraska who'd paid off their farm using her advice. A young woman in Kansas who'd avoided foreclosure by learning to repair her own equipment. A man in Iowa who'd watched his neighbors lose everything and chose a different path. They all said the same thing, in different ways. "Thank you for showing us there was another way." Willa kept the letters in a box in her closet, didn't talk about them, didn't show them to anyone. But sometimes, on winter evenings when the wind howled around the farmhouse and the memories of those hard years came back sharp and clear, she'd read them, and she'd remember why it had all been worth it. The years moved faster after that. Willa turned 65 in 1993, then 70 in 1998, and the farm that had nearly killed her became the thing that kept her alive. Not financially, though she was comfortable in a way she'd never imagined, but spiritually. The land needed her. The young farmers needed her. The lessons needed passing on. And Old Red somehow kept running. It was a warm evening in July of 1998 when the truck came up the driveway. Willa was on the porch swing, the one Jack had built 40 years ago, watching the sun drop toward the horizon. She was 70 now, her hair more silver than brown, her hands gnarled from arthritis, but still strong enough to turn a wrench when needed. The truck was a beat-up Ford Ranger, primer grey, held together with baling wire and determination. A young woman climbed out, maybe 22 or 23, wearing Carhartt coveralls and work boots. "Miss Willa," she called out, "I'm Jenna Hayes. Rob Sullivan sent me. Said you might be able to help." Willa smiled. Rob was always sending people her way. His custom farming business was thriving now, 15 years after the auction. He'd remarried, had a daughter, built a life that was small but solid, debt-free and sustainable. "What's the problem, honey?" Jenna held up a cracked distributor cap. "Got an old Farmall M. Won't start. Think it's this." Willa's smile widened. "Come on into the shed. Let's see what we can do." They walked together across the yard, past the garden where tomatoes hung heavy on the vine, past the small barn where 3 beef cattle drowsed in the evening heat. The machine shed was exactly as it had been 28 years ago, except cleaner now, more organized. Tools hung on pegboard walls, labeled and sorted. Parts bins lined the shelves, each one catalogued. And there, in the center of it all, sat the Farmall M, 49 years old now. The paint was gone almost entirely, just patches of red showing through the rust-pink patina. The seat had been reupholstered twice, most recently with duct tape over foam padding. The tires were originals. Willa had patched them so many times they were more patch than tire. But it ran. God help her, it still ran. "Is that yours?" Jenna asked, staring at it. "Been mine since 1970. Saved my life. Saved this farm." Willa walked to the workbench, opened a coffee can, pulled out a distributor cap. "Here, this'll fit your M, $5. Jenna took it, turned it over in her hands. "Rob said you could fix anything. Said you kept a farm running for 30 years with this tractor and almost no money." "Rob talks too much." But Willa was smiling. "He said you paid off $67,000 in debt, while everyone else was going broke. That was a long time ago. He said I should ask you how you did it." Willa looked at this young woman, seeing herself 3 decades ago. The same determination, the same fear underneath it. The same question. How do I survive this? "You got debt?" Willa asked. $40,000, land contract, variable rate. Jenna's voice went quiet. "I'm scared, Miss Willa. Rates are going up again. What if I can't?" "Can you sell anything you don't need?" "Like what?" "Anything. Furniture, second vehicle, equipment you're not using. Anything that's not making you money, get rid of it. Use that money to pay down principal." "But people will think you're poor. Let them. You know what's worse than people thinking you're poor?" Willa met her eyes. "Actually being poor because you spent money trying to impress people who don't care about you." Jenna was quiet for a moment. Then, "What else?" "Fix everything yourself. Learn how machines work. Read the manuals. It's not magic. It's just mechanics." Willa gestured to the Farmall M. "That tractor's run for 49 years because I learned how to take care of it. Saved me hundreds of thousands of dollars in dealer repairs." "Anything else?" "Don't take on new debt. Not $1. Not for anything. You pay off that 40,000, you stay out of debt for the rest of your life. Because debt is slavery, honey. Doesn't matter how reasonable it sounds. The moment you owe money, someone else owns a piece of your soul." Jenna nodded slowly, absorbing it. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a moment. "Go ahead." "Rob said you could have gotten rich. Said you could have bought more land, expanded, made a fortune in the 80s. Why didn't you?" Willa smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "I watched my husband die on a tractor he couldn't afford. Watched my neighbor lose everything chasing growth. Watched 300,000 farms go under in the 80s, all of them leveraged to the hilt." She walked to the Farmall, ran her hand along the fender. "I chose freedom over fortune, and I've never regretted it. Not once." Jenna paid her $5 for the distributor cap. As she was leaving, she turned back. "Thank you, Miss Willer, for real." "Just pass it on, honey. That's all I ask. Pass it on." The truck rattled away down the driveway, leaving dust hanging in the golden evening light. Willa stood there for a while, watching the dust settle, then walked across the farmyard to the small hill overlooking the creek. Jack's grave was simple, a granite stone, weathered now, with his name and dates and a single line: "Beloved husband, faithful farmer." Willa had planted wildflowers around it years ago. They came up every spring without her help now, blue and yellow and white, turning the grave into a small garden. She knelt, her knees complained, but she ignored them, and pulled a few weeds from around the stone. "Jack," she said quietly, 28 years. Can you believe it? 28 years since I stood in that empty farmyard, with nothing but old red and a mountain of debt." The wind moved through the oak trees, making the leaves whisper. "I did it, though. Paid it all off, kept the farm, built something that'll last." She touched the warm granite. "You wanted that big green tractor to change our lives. You were right, just not the way you thought. Losing it taught me that freedom isn't about what you own. It's about what you don't owe." She stayed there until the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and deep purple. "I hope you're proud," she whispered. "I hope wherever you are, you know I kept my promise. The farm is ours, really ours, and nobody can take it away." She walked back down the hill, past the house, to the machine shed. Old Red sat there in the fading light, patient, waiting, always waiting. Willa climbed up onto the seat one more time, turned the key. The engine caught on the first try, that familiar pop, pop, pop filling the air, steady as a heartbeat. She let it run, just listening, feeling the vibration through the steel seat, through her bones. This machine had saved her. This obsolete, rusty, supposedly worthless piece of farm equipment had been worth more than all the modern marvels her neighbors had bought on credit. Because it was paid for, because it was hers, because freedom has a value that can't be calculated in dollars. After a while, she shut it down, climbed off, patted the fender like you'd pat an old dog. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Then she walked to the house, made herself a simple dinner of vegetables from her garden and a piece of chicken from her own flock, and sat on the porch swing as the stars came out. If you had driven by Willa Morrison's farm that night, you might have seen an old woman on a porch swing, rocking slowly, looking out at land that had nearly broken her, but hadn't. You might have wondered about her life, her story, but you wouldn't have known that she was one of the wealthiest women in 3 counties. Not in flash or show, but in the way that matters. 200 acres of debt-free land, a paid-for home, $420,000 in the bank, and the freedom to wake up every morning answering to no one. You wouldn't have known that she'd survived what killed 300,000 other farms. You wouldn't have known that she'd paid $75,000 with corn grown on an antique tractor and sheer, bloody-minded stubbornness. You wouldn't have known that she'd taught an entire generation of young farmers a different way to survive. All you would have seen was an old woman on a porch swing. But that old woman knew something the world had forgotten, that the slow way is sometimes the only way that lasts, that debt is always more expensive than it looks, that freedom is worth every sacrifice it takes to win it. And if you had asked her, if you had stopped your car and walked up to that porch and asked how she did it, she would have told you the same thing she told every young farmer who came to her door. Live below your means, fix what breaks, don't owe anybody anything, and never, ever bet the farm on a dream you can't afford to lose. Simple words, hard-won wisdom. The kind of wisdom that can only be earned through 10 years in the wilderness, grinding out survival $1 at a time, learning that the real treasure isn't what you own, it's what you don't owe. End card. The 1980s farm crisis resulted in over 300,000 farm foreclosures across America. Variable interest rates hit 21.5% in 1981. Farmers who carried heavy debt lost everything. Farmers who stayed out of debt, like Willa Morrison, survived and thrived. The lesson remains: freedom isn't found in what you own. It's found in what you don't owe. Choose wisely.